My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 32 years old. And the Easter Sunday my brother stood up from the dinner table to announce he'd sold our childhood home was the day I understood that being quiet for long enough can look, to certain people, exactly like consent. He didn't ask me.
He didn't warn me.
He tapped his water glass with a butter knife, the same way our father used to do at holidays, and he waited for the room to go still. Then he said the contract was signed, the buyer was local, closing was in 30 days, and the proceeds would be split 3 ways between himself, our sister Diane, and our mother's estate account. 3 ways. I was at that table. I had driven 2.5 hours to be at that table. I had brought the glazed ham, which was centered between us on a platter our grandmother had owned since 1974. Marcus looked at me when he finished. Not before. After. He said, "We kept it simple. Hope you understand." I nodded. I reached for my fork. I cut a piece of ham and I put it in my mouth and I chewed it slowly while everyone else at the table began asking Marcus questions about the buyer and the timeline and whether the old shed in the backyard would convey with the property. What none of them knew, what Marcus could not have known, because he had never thought to check, was that 3 years before that Easter, my mother had driven herself to the county title office on a Wednesday afternoon in February, handed over a document she had already had notarized, and added my name to the deed of that house as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. She had not made an announcement about it. She had not tapped a water glass. She had handed me a photocopy 2 days later over coffee at her kitchen table and said, simply, "I want you to have standing." I had filed the copy in a manila folder in my home office and gone back to my life. That folder was about to become the most important piece of paper in my family's recent history. I should explain how we got here because the Easter announcement did not come from nowhere. It came from a pattern that had been running in my family for most of my adult life, and understanding the pattern is the only way the rest of this makes sense. My mother, Patricia Callahan, raised 3 children in a 4-bedroom colonial on Aldermore Street in a mid-size Ohio city that had once been a manufacturing town and was now the kind of place people described as coming back. Marcus was the oldest by 6 years. Diane was in the middle. I was the youngest, and I was also, by temperament and by circumstance, the one who stayed. Marcus left for college at 18 and did not come back except at holidays. He built a career in commercial insurance in Atlanta, married a woman named Britt who had strong opinions about open floor plans, and developed, over the years, an orientation toward the family home that was less sentimental and more actuarial. He tracked what things were worth. He knew the square footage. He had opinions about when to sell. Diane left at 22 for a graduate program in landscape architecture in Portland and stayed. She came home more than Marcus, twice a year, sometimes 3 times, but she had built her life at a clean remove from Aldermore Street, and she had a way of referring to the house as Mom's house that carried just underneath it the implication that it was also, in some eventual sense, a problem to be solved. I was the one who stayed. Not because I lacked options, but because I had chosen, deliberately, to build my life in the same city where I had grown up, 2 miles from the house on Aldermore Street. I had a job I was good at. I managed operations for a regional healthcare network, a position I had worked into over 8 years, starting as an administrative coordinator straight out of college. I had an apartment I liked. I had a life that was full and, if not glamorous, genuinely mine. What I also had from the age of 24 onward was proximity to my mother during the years when proximity mattered. My mother was not dramatically ill. She did not have a single defining diagnosis that shaped the last decade of her life. What she had was a slow accumulation of the things that accumulate: a hip replacement at 67, a cardiac event at 70 that was caught early and managed well, a gradual narrowing of the radius of her independence that she handled with more dignity than most people manage. She kept driving until 72. She kept her garden until 74. She cooked her own meals until the last 8 months. During those years, I was the one who drove her to appointments. I was the one who sat with her cardiologist, Dr. Renata Osei, at Lakewood Cardiology Group, and took notes in a small spiral notebook I kept in my purse specifically for that purpose. I was the one who coordinated with her primary care physician, a deliberate and thorough man named Dr. Curtis Faber, when her medication regimen needed adjusting. I was the one who called the pharmacy. I was the one who learned, gradually and practically, how her finances worked, not because I was managing them, but because I was present when the bills arrived and present when the questions came up and present when she needed someone to sit across from her financial advisor, a woman named Helen Marsh at Aldermore Wealth Partners, and make sure the conversation went somewhere useful. Marcus sent money periodically. I want to be accurate about that. He sent checks at Christmas and on her birthday, and when the furnace needed replacing the winter of her 71st year, he sent a check for $4,200 within 4 days of being asked. He was not absent in a financial sense. He was absent in the sense of not being in the room. Diane called twice a week, sometimes more. She was present in a real way over the phone, and she flew in for both of the hospital stays and for the hip surgery. She was a good daughter in the ways she was able to be good from 2,000 miles away. But the appointments and the pharmacy runs and the Wednesday afternoon coffees and the afternoons when my mother simply did not want to be alone, those were mine. I don't say that to claim a prize. I say it because it is the factual record of where I was during those years, and the factual record is what this story turns on. My mother understood this. She never said so directly. She was not a woman who made speeches about her own gratitude, but she showed it in small, consistent ways over time. She kept a house key on a hook by her back door labeled with my name in her handwriting. She introduced me to her neighbors as my daughter Nora, who I rely on. When she updated her estate documents at the age of 73, she called me first to tell me what she had decided, before she called Marcus or Diane. The title addition was part of that. February, 3 years before the Easter announcement. She had already spoken with her estate attorney, a methodical and unhurried man named Gerald Pruitt at Pruitt and Leland on 5th Street, and she had decided that adding me to the deed as joint tenant made structural sense given the way the last several years had arranged themselves. She did not frame it as a reward. She framed it as a practical measure. I want you to have standing, she said, and then she poured us each more coffee, and we talked about something else. I filed the photocopy in the manila folder and went back to my life. My mother died 14 months before the Easter dinner. She died at home, in the room she had slept in for 41 years, in late November, with me in the chair beside her bed and Marcus and Diane on a speakerphone that one of the hospice nurses, a steady and kind woman named Patricia Soto, held up near the bed, so she could hear their voices. It was a quiet death. The kind that people who loved her said, afterward, was the death she would have chosen. The grief was its own country. I don't have language for it that isn't insufficient. What followed the grief was the estate process, and the estate process was where things began to clarify in ways I had not anticipated. Gerald Pruitt walked Marcus, Diane, and me through the estate documents in his conference room 6 weeks after the funeral. The will was straightforward. The personal property was distributed in ways that reflected my mother's characteristic fairness. The grandmother's china to Diane, the set of leather-bound books our father had collected to Marcus, small specific items to various cousins and friends. The estate account, after expenses, came to approximately $218,000 to be divided equally among the three of us after a standard probate period. The house was not part of the estate account. Gerald Pruitt said this in the same tone he used for everything, measured, precise, without editorial comment. The house at Aldermore Street, he explained, had passed outside of probate by operation of law at the time of my mother's death, because the deed listed 2 joint tenants with right of survivorship, Patricia and Callahan and Nora Marie Callahan. Upon the death of one joint tenant, title vested automatically in the surviving joint tenant. Me. Marcus's chair made a sound against the conference room floor. Diane set her pen down. Gerald Pruitt continued. He said that the house was, as of the date of my mother's death, titled solely in my name. He said this was a recorded document, on file with the county recorder's office, and had been since February of the year my mother filed it. He said he was available to answer questions. Marcus asked 3 questions in rapid succession, each one slightly louder than the last. Gerald Pruitt answered each one with the same, even cadence. Yes, the document was valid. Yes, it had been properly executed and notarized. Yes, my mother had been of sound mind and had acted with full legal capacity. Dr. Faber had provided a letter to that effect at the time of filing, as was standard practice for clients of a certain age making significant title transfers. Diane said, very quietly, "Did you know about this, Nora?" I said yes. The room was still for a moment. I told them that Mom had told me about it when she filed it, and that I had a copy, and that I had not brought it up because I had assumed Gerald would explain it as part of the estate process, which he just had. Marcus said we would need to discuss this. I said of course. We did not discuss it that afternoon. We drove to the house separately and met in the kitchen, and Marcus stood at the counter for a long time looking out the window at the backyard while Diane sat at the table with her hands folded in front of her. I made coffee. I set 3 mugs on the counter. Marcus's position, stated carefully, was that Mom had not understood what she was doing. That the title transfer had been executed at a point when she was, in his words, increasingly dependent on you, meaning me, and that the transfer reflected that dependence rather than an informed choice. He did not use the word undue influence, but the shape of what he was saying was clear. I said I understood why he felt that way. I also said that Dr. Faber's letter was in Gerald Pruitt's file, that the transfer had been reviewed by an attorney, that the notarization was clean, and that my mother had called me 2 days after filing to make sure I had received my copy and to confirm I understood what it meant. I told him I had a record of that phone call. Marcus said we should take some time. I said of course. We took 14 months. During those 14 months, Marcus and Diane and I were not in open conflict. That is important to say accurately. We communicated. We shared the estate process tasks in a reasonable way. We attended the probate hearings. We signed the documents we needed to sign. We had a Thanksgiving at Diane's rental in the city, the first Thanksgiving after my mother's death, and it was tender and difficult in the way those first holidays always are, and nobody mentioned the house. What was happening underneath that surface I did not know in real time. I learned it later, in pieces, from a sequence of events that began on a Tuesday morning in April, 3 days after Easter. At Easter, Marcus had made his announcement, and I had sat with it quietly. After dinner, I had helped clear the table and wrapped the leftover ham and driven home and sat in my kitchen for a long time with a glass of water. I did not call Gerald Pruitt that night. I did not pull out the manila folder. I went to bed at 10:15 and slept, and in the morning I went to work. On Tuesday, at 11:14 in the morning, my cell phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. The area code was local. I answered. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Claire Souza. She said she was a real estate agent working with a buyer who had an accepted offer on a property at Aldermore Street, and that she was calling because a title search run by the buyer's attorney had returned a recorded ownership document in my name, and she needed to clarify the situation before the transaction could proceed. I said I could clarify it. I said my name was on the deed, because my mother had added me as a joint tenant 3 years prior, and that upon my mother's death, title had vested solely in me by operation of law. There was a pause. Claire Souza said, "So you're the current owner of record?" I said yes. She said she needed to call the listing agent. She said she would be in touch. I thanked her and ended the call. I sat at my desk for a moment. Then I opened my desk drawer and took out the manila folder and looked at the title document for the first time in over a year. The notary stamp was clear. The recording stamp from the county recorder's office was clear. My name was printed in clean block letters on the second line of the ownership field. I closed the folder and called Gerald Pruitt. Gerald Pruitt was not surprised. He said he had been expecting something like this call and that he had already pulled the relevant documents in anticipation. He walked me through my position in approximately 12 minutes. In the methodical and unhurried way, he did everything. The deed was valid. The joint tenancy had operated as written. I was the owner of record. Any contract of sale executed without my signature was not a valid conveyance of title. The buyer's title insurance company would identify this immediately in the search, which, he noted, they apparently already had. He asked how I wanted to proceed. I told him I wanted to understand all of my options before I decided anything. He said that was wise, and we scheduled a meeting for Thursday afternoon. What happened in the hours between my call with Claire Souza and my Thursday meeting with Gerald Pruitt was a sequence of events I did not orchestrate and could not have predicted, because it was a sequence of events that Marcus and Diane's own choices had set in motion. Claire Souza called the listing agent. The listing agent called Marcus. Marcus called me at 12:47 while I was eating lunch at my desk. He said, "What did you say to the realtor?" I said I had told her the truth about the title. He said, "This is not how this was supposed to go." I asked him how it was supposed to go. He said they had planned to handle the deed transfer as part of the closing, that Gerald Pruitt had advised them, which was a statement that later proved to be a significant mischaracterization of what Gerald Pruitt had actually said, and that I was creating a problem that didn't need to exist. I said I hadn't created anything. I said the county recorder's office had done that 3 years ago. Marcus said he needed me to sign a quitclaim deed so the sale could move forward. I said I would speak with my attorney. He said, "Nora?" I said, "I'll be in touch after Thursday." I ended the call. The Thursday meeting with Gerald Pruitt lasted just under 2 hours. He walked me through the full picture with the patience and precision that had made him my mother's attorney for 19 years. He had pulled the listing agreement Marcus and Diane had signed with their real estate agent, a document that, he noted, they had no legal authority to execute as sole owners because they were not the sole owners. He had pulled the purchase agreement with the buyer. He had a copy of the title search the buyer's attorney had commissioned, which confirmed what Claire Souza had told me. My name was on record, the transfer was valid, and the existing contract was unenforceable without my signature. Gerald also told me something I had not known. He said that Marcus had called his office 6 weeks after our first estate meeting, this was 11 months ago now, and asked Gerald, in a general and hypothetical way, whether there were grounds to challenge a title transfer made by an elderly parent to an adult child. Gerald had told him, in a general and unhypothetical way, that such challenges were difficult to sustain when the transfer had been reviewed by an attorney, executed before a notary, and supported by a physician's letter attesting to the grantor's competence. He said Marcus had thanked him and ended the call, and that he had not contacted Gerald again. What Marcus had apparently done instead was proceed as though the title transfer did not exist, sign a listing agreement, accept an offer, and wait to see if anyone would notice. Someone had noticed. The title search had noticed. The buyer's attorney had noticed. Claire Souza had noticed. Gerald asked me, again, how I wanted to proceed. I thought about the glazed ham on my grandmother's platter. I thought about Marcus tapping his water glass with a butter knife. I thought about my mother driving herself to the title office on a Wednesday in February and handing over a document she had already had notarized. "I want you to have standing," she had said. I told Gerald I was not going to sign a quitclaim deed. I told him I was not interested in forcing a sale of the house either. I said I wanted to understand what a fair resolution looked like, and I wanted that resolution to be documented, and I wanted to proceed in a way that reflected the actual legal reality of the situation rather than the version of reality my siblings had been operating in. Gerald said that was a reasonable position, and we began to work out what it meant in practice. The buyer walked away from the contract 11 days after the title search returned my name. Their attorney sent a letter to the listing agent citing an unresolvable title defect. The earnest money, $9,500, was returned in full. The listing was pulled from the market. I know about the phone calls that followed because Diane told me later when we had arrived at a place where honesty between us was possible again. She said Marcus called her 6 times the afternoon the buyer's attorney sent the letter. She said he spent most of those calls explaining that the situation was recoverable, that I would come around, that this was a misunderstanding that could be fixed. She said she listened to all 6 calls, and at the end of the 6th one she told him that she thought he had made a serious mistake and that she was going to call me herself. She called me on a Friday evening. I was at home. She said, "I think I owe you an apology." I asked her what she was apologizing for. She said she had known about the listing before Easter. She said Marcus had brought her in 6 weeks before the holiday and presented the plan: list the house, close in spring, split the proceeds 3 ways, handle the deed issue at closing, and she had not pushed back hard enough. She said she had told herself it would work out, that it was simpler not to involve me in the planning stages, that I would understand once it was done. She said that was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I agreed to it. I said I appreciated her calling.
I said I wanted to tell her something.
I said that in the year since our mother's estate had been processed, I had not once considered forcing any particular outcome with the house. I had not planned a confrontation. I had not been waiting for a moment. I had been living my life and going to work and letting the situation exist without needing to resolve it on any particular timeline. What I had not expected was for Marcus to try to resolve it without me. Diane said, "What do you want to do with the house?" I said I didn't know yet. I said I needed some time to think clearly about it, and I needed Marcus to be part of that conversation, and I needed that conversation to happen in a room with Gerald Pruitt present, because I was not willing to have it any other way. She said she could make that happen. The meeting took place on a Thursday morning, 5 weeks after the buyer had walked away from the contract. Marcus flew in from Atlanta. Diane drove from her rental. I drove from my apartment. We met in Gerald Pruitt's conference room, which had the same conference table and the same gray carpet and the same framed print of Lake Erie on the wall as it had on the morning Gerald had explained to Marcus and Diane, with his characteristic even-handedness, that I owned the house. Marcus was careful. I will give him that. He had prepared. He had brought a folder of his own which contained, as far as I could tell, a printout of comparable sales in the neighborhood and a handwritten list of points he intended to make. He was wearing a jacket. He looked like a man who had decided to treat this like a negotiation. He opened by saying he wanted to move forward constructively. I said I did too. He said he understood that the deed transfer was valid and that he accepted that. He said what he wanted was to find a path to a resolution that worked for all three of us. I said I was listening. He laid out a proposal. He said he thought the house should be sold. He said the market was favorable, that the neighborhood had appreciated significantly, and that holding the asset didn't make financial sense when the proceeds could be distributed and invested. He said he proposed that I receive a larger share of the net proceeds to reflect the title situation and my years of proximity to my mother. His phrase was a larger share, and that we move forward from there. I said, "What share?" He said he had been thinking 40% to me, 30% each to him and Diane. I said, "Gerald, can you tell Marcus what the property most recently appraised at?" Gerald Pruitt opened his folder and said the property had been appraised at $387,000 in the assessment conducted the prior tax year. I said, 40% of $387,000 is approximately $154,800. Is that the number you're proposing? Marcus said the net proceeds after commission and closing costs would be lower. I said I understood that. I asked if he was proposing $154,800 or something in that range as my share.
He said approximately yes.
I said, no. The room was quiet. I said, I want to be clear about what I'm saying no to. I'm not saying no to a sale. I'm not saying no to a resolution. I'm saying no to that specific number and that specific structure, because that specific structure does not reflect the legal reality of the situation. I said, the legal reality is that I own this house. Not 40% of it. All of it. And any path forward from here involves me making a choice about what to do with something that is mine. I want to make that choice carefully and fairly, but I want to make it from an accurate starting point. Marcus said that was a maximalist position. I said I prefer to call it an accurate one. Gerald Pruitt said, quietly, that he agreed with my characterization of the legal position. Marcus looked at his folder. He looked at his handwritten list of points. He set his pen down on the conference table. Diane said, what would you consider fair, Nora?
I had thought about this.
I had spent 5 weeks thinking about it, not with anger, but with the kind of deliberate attention I brought to my work, the kind where you look at a situation from every angle before you decide what you think about it. I said I didn't want to profit from the house at my siblings' expense. I said that had never been the point, and I didn't believe it had been my mother's point either. I said I thought the house should be sold because holding it wasn't something I had the bandwidth to manage indefinitely, and because the neighborhood was not going to be more favorable to sell in 5 years than it was now. I said I wanted an equal 3-way split of the net proceeds, 1/3 each. Diane's shoulders moved. Marcus said, you'd be leaving money on the table. I said I was aware of that. He said, why? I said because my mother had given me standing, not a prize. I said she had not put my name on that deed so that I could squeeze every dollar out of a situation she had created to protect me. She had put my name on that deed so that a decision about the house could not be made without me in the room. I said, "We're in the room now. This is what I want." Gerald Pruitt drafted the agreement before noon. Marcus and Diane signed it at the conference table. I signed it after them. The house sold 8 weeks later. A different agent. A cleaner process. The buyer was a young couple, first home, pre-approved, no contingencies except inspection. The inspection came back with 2 minor items, a section of weathered fascia board on the east side of the roof and a water heater that was 8 years past its expected lifespan, and we split the repair allowance credit without argument. The net proceeds after commission, credit, and closing costs came to $341,200. Each of us received approximately $113,733. I used my share to pay off the remaining balance on my apartment and put the rest into an index account I had been building for 4 years. I did not buy anything dramatic with it. I did not take a trip or renovate anything. I put it away and went back to work on Monday. The house at Aldermore Street changed hands on a Thursday in late October. I was not at the closing. There was no reason for me to be, since the paperwork had been handled. But I drove past the house that evening on my way home from the office, which was not exactly on my route but not far out of the way either. There was a moving truck in the driveway. The young couple was carrying boxes in through the front door, the storm door propped open with a boot. The porch light was on. Someone had already put a mat down on the front step. I drove past without stopping. Diane and I talk regularly now. She calls on Sunday evenings, which is the same day our mother used to call, and there is something in that timing that I think is deliberate, though we have never named it. We talk about her work and mine and about the small texture of our lives, and sometimes about our mother, a memory that surfaces, a thing she used to say, a recipe we are trying to reconstruct from notes she left in a spiral notebook in the kitchen drawer. Marcus and I are cordial. That is the honest word for it. We communicate when there is something to communicate about, and we are unfailingly polite, and there is a distance between us now that I don't think either of us knows how to close. I am not certain it needs to be closed. Some distances exist because they accurately reflect a gap that was always there. I have thought, many times, about what would have happened if my mother had not driven to the title office on that February Wednesday. If she had left the deed as it was. If she had not thought to give me standing. The house would have sold in the spring, as planned. I would have been informed after the fact, or perhaps during, when the closing was imminent, and my absence from the room would have been presented as a practical efficiency. The proceeds would have been divided in whatever way Marcus had determined was equitable, and I would have received whatever number he arrived at, because I would have had no legal position from which to say otherwise. My mother understood that. She understood it before I did. She understood, with the precision of a woman who had watched her own family for 74 years, exactly what I would and would not do on my own behalf, and she understood that what I would not do was fight. Not because I lacked the capacity, but because I had spent so long making myself small in that family that smallness had come to feel like my natural size. She did not change my size. She just made sure that when the moment came, the record would show the truth. The record showed the truth. That was enough. There's a thing I came to understand in the months after the house sold, in the quiet that followed all of it. The moments that change the terms of a relationship are rarely the loud ones. They are rarely the confrontations or the announcements or the butter knife on the water glass moments. They are the February Wednesdays. They are the photocopy handed over a coffee table with 6 words. They are the manila folder in the desk drawer, undramatic and patient, waiting for the morning it becomes necessary. My mother gave me something that could not be argued with, amended, or explained away. She gave it quietly, the same way she had done most of the important things in her life. What I gave myself, in the end, was the decision about what to do with it. And I chose the same thing she had always chosen when she had a choice. The fair thing, offered steadily, without theater. The people who write you out of the room do not usually account for the possibility that you already have a chair there. They assume the room is theirs to arrange. Sometimes the most complete answer to that assumption is simply to be found, already seated, when the title search comes back. If someone in your life quietly took a step to protect you, one you didn't fully understand until it mattered, I'd love to know about it in the comments. What did they do, and when did you finally realize what it meant? And if this story stayed with you, please consider subscribing. New stories every week. This is an original fictional story created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All names, characters, events, and details are invented and do not represent real individuals or actual events.